Okay, what we want to cover today are the two chapters in the book, 14 on 15. 14 deals with firms in competitive markets. And as I said in class, or if I didn't, I'll tell you again, in a competitive market, the demand curve is horizontal. There are many firms and many buyers in that marketplace. So whatever firm is in that marketplace, they have to accept the price that's out there. Classic example is soap at a grocery store. There's all kinds of brands of soap, all different prices, sometimes the quantities vary. Soap is a classic example of how firms have used changes in quantity to keep them competitive and keep their costs in line and keep their prices down. For instance, I don't know if any of you use Dove soap, the bar soap, but if you've noticed, they've cut out indentation in the soap, and they did that to reduce the quantity and the price, and of course the cost of the soap, so that they can leave the price the same. Next, then we'll talk about uh, monopolistic competition, or not monopolistic competition, but how a monopolist works. And so comparing these two together makes it an ideal situation, and it makes it a lot easier for you to understand the differences between the two. So let's get started. All right. Competitive market, as I said, has many buyers and many sellers. No one buyer or no one seller can influence the market either from a price or a quantity standpoint. Sellers can enter the market easily and freely. Okay, just come up with a product that's got appeal, and you can enter that marketplace. No one supplier or buyer single-handedly can influence the market price, or entry or exit of the market is fairly easy. So as I said, market price is the price that you have to sell at if you want to be in that market. You have to be able to develop a product that meets the cost criteria that you need so that you can make money still at the market price that's given and by the market. Again, it's a horizontal line, and it means that that is your price. All right, type of market is typical of consumer staples. We use the example continually of soap. There's lots of soap on the shelf, whether you're talking about dish soap, whether you're talking about laundry soap, whether you're talking about bath soap, there's a ton of it out there, and a lot of different companies supplying it. Okay, in the grocery supply, the grocery store, if you don't like the cost of something, and I use again the issue of chocolate chip cookies, they raise the price of a pack of chocolate chip cookies 50 cents, so I'll walk away, go further down the aisle, and I'll either pick up a different kind of chocolate chip cookie, or I might even compromise my standards and get a sugar cookie or something else. Same is true of candy. So ultimately, if we don't like what we see in the store we're in, we can always go to another store, particularly in the metropolitan areas. There are lots of stores around to shop in. Okay, demand curve in a competitive market. The demand curve in a competitive market is flat and a straight line. So that means that it's horizontal, flat, and in a straight line. And harken back to what we talked about elasticity, that curve means it is perfectly elastic or unitary elastic. No one buyer, even sellers, can influence the price. No one seller or a group of sellers controls the market. There are so many close substitutes for the product that therefore the consumer has many choices. Now here is an interesting point, the question of close substitutes. For instance, what's the difference between laundry soaps, Tide versus what's another brand of laundry soap? I don't know. I think Tide, and I think I don't know soaps. Anyway, Tide and what's the stuff my wife uses? Anyway, you have a choice. You don't have to go to the particular brand. There's always substitutes. You can use something else for soap. One of the things that was always interesting to me was shaving cream. You'd buy shaving cream, it'd pop out of a pressurized bottle, you put it on your face, and you'd shave. Well, all that shaving cream is soap under containerization that causes it to foam out. You can do the same thing and accomplish the same purpose with a bar of soap, work it in your hands, get a lather up, put it on your face, and shave. Chocolate chip cookie example. Here we go. You'll love this. Chocolate chip cookie is a perfect example of a competitive market. Many buyers, many sellers. Availability of so many close substitutes. Sugar cookies, for instance. Raisin cookies. All kinds of different cookies. You have a substitution, you can get cake or candy. It's there to satisfy a sugar need. Now, branding is critical in a competitive market. What companies try to do that are competing in a competitive market is to put branding on their products so that when you go to the store and you see their name, that's the product you picked up because you saw it in a commercial, on a billboard, and you like the brand, you like their packaging, you like what they have to say. Okay, it means that it sets up a preference in your mind so that you automatically go to that one. Okay. One of the biggest examples, or the old example that I use, is when we first started the computer business in mainframe computers, we would do programs on card stock. They were computer cards. But IBM was such a dominant force in mainframe computers that those cards were called IBM cards. That's branding. Kroger, by the way, bakes the best chocolate chip cookies in the world, other than my own. Competitive market. Here's an example. A perfectly competitive market, you'll have the price line is fixed, so that quantity demanded and supply is where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect. And in effect, the perfectly competitive market, as we said, really the demand curve is the price line. And at that point, at equilibrium, is where marginal cost is equal to the price. So for a competitive market, the price equals marginal cost, and also we'll talk about average cost. Competitive firm. This is a competitive firm. Again, there's our demand line, flat, okay? And where we have to sell our product is on that demand line, and we have to make sure that our marginal cost and our average total cost are equal. So that on that demand curve and where we can sell our product in a competitive market, the demand or the price has to equal average revenue plus, and of course, marginal revenue are equal. As in addition to that, marginal cost and average total cost are also equal to that price. Branding, critical in this type of environment. Important concept, popularization of a product because you see it, it's a household word, you go for it, you buy it on the shelf. Question of Tide, soap, dish soap, Tide, or laundry soap. You see that big circle, red container. That's the kind I buy because I see it on the commercials on television, I see it on billboards, I see it in newspapers. That's what branding is all about. Attractive to the eye and makes someone automatically just grab it because it's branded that way and they love it. Competitive market supplier has to use advertising. So advertising is a big part of a budget. I remember when I came out of college, I interviewed with Procter & Gamble, and as a management trainee, what they would do is they would assign me to a product team. And I think at the time, the product team they were talking about assigning me to was their soap, Tide laundry soap. Didn't take the job. It didn't really interest me. I ended up getting into the computer business, which was more exciting. So that's what branding is all about. The objective is that you grab that product because you've seen it on television. You know the name, the IBM card, Tide. You see the bottle, you know exactly what it looks like, It's been implanted in your head through advertising, and you think it's the best that anyone else has owned. Lately, the grocery stores and supermarkets have started to brand their own. I know, and as a result of branding their own, what they do is they give substantial discounts to members. If you're in their club, like Kroger, I have a Kroger card. And if I buy their product, I get a bigger discount and I pay a lot less for it than I would say for a Tide product. As long as it's the Kroger brand, and it could be Tide even making it for Kroger, who knows? I know this water I buy at Kirkland is actually put out by Niagara and branded for Kirkland for sale at Costco stores by Niagara Water Company. I hope you can see it. I have it with me in class, and it's a company that provides water, Niagara Water, but they also do their work for Kirkland and for Costco. Okay, so branding is used to separate firm's product from other competitors. That is the purpose of branding. So branding is used to separate a firm's product from other competitors through household words. They continually preach these words to you. Coke, Pepsi, McDonald's Big Mac, Burger King, home of the Whopper. Okay, these are terms and words that they use to brand their products because, again, they're in a competitive market. McDonald's and Burger King are selling the same product. They have to find a way to differentiate the two. And that's what branding is all about. Okay, understanding revenue for a competitive firm. Revenue is the total value of all sales. We've talked about that before over a given period of time. So from that revenue, we subtract fixed and variable costs to arrive at profit before tax and dividends. We just did that in the last chapter. And average revenue is the amount of revenue earned per unit of the product. Just like we looked at average cost, we can now talk about average revenue, which is the revenue per product or per unit. So understanding costs, fixed cost. We went through this in the last chapter. Costs associated with elements that are always fixed. Rent, for instance, electricity. No matter what the firm produces, those things are fixed costs. They're not going to change. It takes a lot of effort to change the rent. Might be moving to another building, negotiate a new contract, etc. Electricity is electricity. You're going to pay for whatever you use. Variable costs. Costs associated with level of production vary with the amount the firm produces. For example, wages, salaries, and advertising. I showed you that in the last chart that we did in the last chapter, last class. All right, marginal revenue and marginal cost. We think of marginal revenue means change. Margin always means change in economics. In this context, the change in the per unit revenue and the cost is the marginal revenue or cost. So at the point where the marginal revenue curve intersects with the marginal cost curve, what you have is marginal revenue equaling marginal cost. And in the case of competitive markets, that is the price that the product can be sold at, and in effect represents the demand curve because there is only one price. So subtracting one from the other, we arrive at a change in profit from the production of each unit. Again, we covered that with that profit and loss statement that I put together. We subtracted the product cost from the revenue. We subtracted the fixed and variable costs from the revenue, and then we calculated those on a per unit basis. Now, firms have to ask the question all the time of themselves. Should I increase or decrease my unit production? And if I do I make more or do I make less money? Very, very critical thing. That is why profit is great to know from an accounting point of view, but if you really want to understand your costs, you've got to do it on a per unit basis, fixed versus variable. From that type of information, the business can restructure their costs and also possibly their revenue to improve their profitability. One of the things, my first job I took in financial analysis with the old Burroughs Corporation, is that we wanted to look at unit cost. And that's why they hired me as opposed to a financial person. They wanted someone with an economics background as well. All right, marginal cost as the supply curve. For all intents and purposes, the short-run supply curve for a firm and the marginal cost curve are the same, and they're upward sloping and to the right. We've seen that before in demand and supply. So for the firm, the point at which the price is equal to the average total revenue, which is equal to the marginal revenue, is their sweet spot. If the firm produces above that point, its marginal cost will go up and profit will go down. Below that point, it represents an opportunity to increase profits. So a firm will always, if they're above that point, the firm will always move to get back to that point. If the firm is below that point, they will always move to get up to that point. So that in one case, and in each case, they can improve profitability. So there's supply curve. Here's what it looks like. Marginal cost curve and the supply curve is exactly the same. So you'll notice, once again, like we talked about in the last chapter, the marginal cost curve intersects, okay, the average total cost and the average variable cost at their lowest points. So if you go above that point, if you can sell that at that price, that's great. You're making a profit. You're making a bigger profit. If you can sell at an even higher price, like say take P1 for instance, if that is the price, you've made profit. P2, you've made even more profits. Higher quantities, higher profits, if that's possible in the marketplace. Okay, so competitive firms profit. Here's how they make money. The price is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to average revenue, which is equal to marginal cost. So you'll see that the firm produces a product at marginal cost where the marginal cost curve intersects the marginal revenue curve. And both of those, and that intersection point is above the average total cost and the average variable cost. The difference between the two is where the firm is profitable. So one thing the firm doesn't want to do is produce at a marginal cost level where you see M1, MC1 versus Q1. They don't want to be there. To get up to MC3 and Q3 is a stretch. If nobody buys it, and they probably will not because the price is below that, they will end up with an inventory situation. So other concepts. In the long run, as we've said before, all costs are variable. They're variable because a business can elect to go out of business. It can close a plant. It can stop producing a particular product. The hula hoops, for instance. Barbie dolls are going through the same type of thing. Okay, close the plant, stop making the product, substitute another product, like Apple does, continually bring out new products. But in reality, in the long run, all costs are variable. We can reduce the rent by going to a different building. All right, concept that's involved in this, of course, is sunk cost. This generally refers to a cost that's not easily recoverable and has limited market for resale. Again, when I worked for Burroughs, I did the financial justification for a 100,000 square foot disc file plant in Mission Viejo, California. Okay. Once we made the decision to build that plant, we had expended money that were sunk costs. So it would be very difficult for us, for Burroughs Corporation, to have sold that building, and it would have taken time and it would have costed money to get it sold, and they might have had to take a loss on it. So expensive pieces of machinery, they're not easily moved and bolted to the floor, and land and building built for a specific purpose. The example I just gave you, of course, was the 100,000 square foot plant in Mission Viejo, California. I eventually became the controller of that plant. All right, chapter 15. Now let's talk about monopolies. Okay, whole different concept. This is not a competitive marketplace. A monopoly is a company that owns the market. Therefore, they own the demand curve because there's nobody else selling in the market but our monopolist. So let's talk about it. Resources. If you can have a monopolist, if you have all the resources owned by a single firm. Classic example is AT&T. They were broken up in 1984. Prior to 1984, AT&T owned all the copper, all the phone lines in the US, Canada, and even had an international cable going over to Europe. So everything that was linked to telephones that you did over a telephone at that point in time was owned by AT&T. So because of that, they were able to sell the phones in the home. They were able to do all kinds of things and control the marketplace. But in 1984, they agreed with the federal government that they needed to be broken up. Government regulations, governments, just as a sidelight, a government can create a monopoly. They issue a patent for a new product. You then have a monopoly on that product. No one else can produce it. You write a book and you copyright it. The book is then copyrighted. No one else can copyright or use parts of that book unless they have your permission and possibly pay you money for it. Low-cost producers can be monopolists. A single firm can produce a product that nobody else can do. A natural monopoly, we call it. So a single firm produces a product at a lower cost than any other firms. It's called a natural monopoly. For instance, back to AT&T, the building of networks that were housed all the telephones. Also building of networks for the electrical grid in a municipality. Electricity sold to homeowners and to businesses is a regulated monopoly. In other words, the monopolist sets the price, but he has to get approval from the local government to sell in the community at that price. So the utility has to go to the local government and get approval to sell their product, in this case electricity, to the local communities at a specific price. And the utility has to get that permission from the government before they can actually do it. So what this is a controlled monopoly or a government-sponsored monopoly. So, monopoly or competition. Again, as I said, the monopolist owns the demand curve. The firm has the ability to produce any quantity at any price. If you want it, you're going to have to pay his price. So the monopolist demand curve is downward sloping and to the right, but it's a very, very steep curve. And that means it's very, very inelastic. Okay? We'll look at a couple of curves and you'll get the idea what I mean. All right, competitor with many suppliers owns all a part of the demand curve. Now, this is another situation. In competition, the competitors cannot influence the marketplace or the demand curve. So there are a lot of buyers, a lot of sellers in a competitive market. It's the interaction of many suppliers selling at only market price. And again, as we said earlier in the last chapter, they have to accept the price on the shelf as the market price, and they have to produce and sell against that price. And they have to have their costs under control enough that the costs provide them with a profit for their efforts. A monopolist revenue. Since the monopolist owns the demand curve, his revenue is based on the price and quantity at which he sells the product. Now, unlike a competitive firm, which may have multiple prices for different products, monopolist has a single price, whatever he wants to choose to price it at, to sell his product. The more a monopolist can sell at the higher price, the higher the revenue will be. This is called the output effect. So he produces more and he can sell more and improve his revenue. The lower the price monopolist sells at, the lower his revenue. This is called the price effect. So on the high side, when we talk about pricing at very high levels, this is the output effect. If we produce at a low revenue level, this is called the price effect. Monopoly profit. Again, monopolist owns the demand curve, so his marginal revenue is always less than the demand or average revenue. To maximize profits, the monopolist has to determine the point at which the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue. So what the monopolist is looking at, he wants his marginal cost equal whatever his marginal revenue is. I'm going to show you how that works in a couple of graphs in a minute. Now, since the average revenue is higher, the monopolist maximizes profits at the price directly above the average total cost on the demand curve. Now, this is called monopoly profits, and it's an area above the points of intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue. So let's look at it. Monopoly profit. Here we go. The old demand and supply curve issue. Okay? Look at marginal cost as though it's the supply curve. Look at marginal revenue as the marginal revenue he will receive, and look at average revenue as what he can price it at. So what you see happening is that at the point B, let's assume in this case that our monopolist can sell it at a price that's measured by a line from P to A. Okay. His costs, however, are down in the B area. That's his average total cost. And so his monopolistic profit, which is above what normal profit would be, if you look at, for instance, the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, you see how far above he is above that curve. Normal profit might be the point B on that quantity, but he's able to get more profit for the same amount of quantity because his average revenue is higher and he can sell at that price. He's not selling at C, he's selling at P. So the monopolistic profit is the difference between those two. In this chart, it's been labeled supernormal profit. So, continuing on. Monopoly versus competition. Please note that on the last graph, the marginal supply curve and the marginal demand curve for a competitive market equals price is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to marginal cost. So for a competitive market, the price they're selling at, a flat line, marginal revenue must equal marginal cost, and that is their equilibrium point. Now that's for a competitive company. For monopolist, the point at which the firm can maximize profits. He's not stuck with a flat demand curve. He is the demand curve. So his price is always greater than the marginal revenue, which is equal to the marginal cost. As we just showed in the last graph, his price is higher. Profit maximization. Let's talk about that. Back to the accounting concepts of profit and loss. The monopolist maximizes profits when he sells a point above the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue. We saw that in that graph. I'll say that again. The monopolist maximizes profits. He gets obscene profits over and above where he should get profits because he's pricing and selling above the point where marginal cost and marginal revenue are equal. So the profit is determined in accounting sense by the difference between the monopoly price and the average total cost. This again is how much the monopolist has gained over and above a market equilibrium point. So where market equilibrium sits, the monopolist prices his product above that equilibrium point. Now there is a deadweight loss associated with this. And the deadweight loss is if you look at the demand curve and the supply curve, which is a marginal cost curve, you'll see the equilibrium point. Okay? But the monopolist quantity is less, and as a result, he's able to sell it as a higher price, at a higher price. So his revenue would be normally at the intersection of marginal cost, okay, and marginal revenue, or at an equilibrium price, which is where the demand curve and the marginal cost curve intersect. But in effect, as you see here, he's selling at a lower quantity, but at a higher price. So he's controlling the marketplace. He's controlling the demand curve. So price discrimination, let's talk about that. Okay, businesses engage in price discrimination for various reasons. Some of them make sense, some of them don't, but it's generally whatever helps to sell more product. Okay, so let's assume that a business can charge different prices for the same service. Let's take the example of theater tickets. Seniors pay a lower price and students pay a lower price for theater tickets than the general theater goer. Discount coupons at stores. In an effort to buy their products, the stores issue coupons, or you become part of their system, their point system. Financial aid for college tuition. This again, because you're going to college, you can get financial aid only because you're going to college. Airline ticket prices are another example. Airlines price tickets based on where they can get the most amount of money for the tickets. For instance, I used to live in the Palm Springs area. Palm Springs airline tickets to fly into Palm Springs are probably twice what they are in the summer as in January, February, March. All the snowbirds come in to Palm Springs, fly in during the winter months, January, February, March, particularly the Canadians. They call them snowbirds. So ticket prices during the wintertime, priced by the airlines, are a lot higher than they are in the summertime, because very few people want to go to the desert and suffer through 100, 110 degree temperatures. Also, quantity discounts. That is another example of how businesses charge different prices for the same thing. This is the old story we talked about before in the grocery store, where if you buy one, you get one free, or the second one you buy is half price. So those are quantity discounts. Those are all a form of price discrimination. Don't know how you feel about that, but whatever you do, leave the senior discounts alone. They're pretty good. I like those. All right. Are these practices unfair because they are available to some but not all? As I said, make sure you leave us seniors alone. So think about that. Is that unfair? Is it unfair for theater tickets to be cheaper for seniors and students? Okay. Let's go back to the AT&T breakup, which is a classic example of a monopolistic situation. The modern day breakup of AT&T in 1984 was an agreement between the Antitrust Division, the Justice Department, and AT&T. This is probably the most recent type of breakup of a monopoly we've had in this country. The Justice Department has a division, an antitrust division of the Justice Department. They handle and investigate these types of things. Of course, AT&T was already in existence, so it was extremely difficult to break it up. But they actually ended up doing it. Right now, in today's world, the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department steps in before acquisitions and mergers occur. For instance, AT&T today, the new AT&T, is trying to buy one of the cable networks. I forget which one it is. Anyway, they're trying to buy one of the cable networks. But the Justice Department is saying, look, you guys own a satellite division, okay, and Disk TV, I believe it is. You own a satellite division. That would give you monopolistic control over not only the satellite side of it, but also the cable set-top box side of it. So the Justice Department is pushing back at AT&T acquiring one of the cable companies. So back in time, AT&T in 1884 owned most or all of the phone lines US, Canada, and therefore they set the prices. If you wanted to transmit something over one of their lines, you had to pay a fee to AT&T. In the agreement, AT&T would divest itself of 7 Bell operating companies, which became known as the telecoms or the Seven Sisters. Now, what they did was they broke it up geographically. Canada became its own. The Northeast was New York Tel. The Southeast was Bell South. The West was, what was the West? Pacific Tel. All of these companies were set aside as 7 Bell operating companies. Today there are a lot less, but they eventually ended up merging and everything else. The interesting thing about this whole thing is that in 1984, the telephone lines carried everything. But today now we have fiber optic cable, we have cell phones that operate off of a tower. So the breakup of AT&T was going to occur anyway because of competitive features. Number one, satellites, cell phones, all those things were to be in the future competitors of AT&T. But in 1984, the Justice Department couldn't see that happening or couldn't see it occurring, which is probably logical. All right, the regional Bell operating companies. This is what the map looked like. NYNEX, New York Tel, Bell Atlantic, Bell South, Ameritech, which is the Midwest, Southwestern Bell, which is Texas for the most part, Pacific Telesis, and US West. Now, of course, they've all reconsolidated again. Verizon has most of the West Coast. AT&T, which is Bell Atlantic. Let's take a look at what they are. SBC Communications is currently in existence. It is the old Ameritech, which it acquired in 1999. 2005, it acquired AT&T and renamed the whole SBC Communications AT&T. And in 2006, they acquired Bell South. So AT&T now is a combination of what was SBC, Ameritech, the old AT&T, and Bell South. So they broke them up, but they're starting to come back together again. Bell Atlantic, through mergers and purchases, Bell Atlantic became Pacific Telesis and NYNEX. US West, GTE, merged with Bell Atlantic to become Verizon. And now Verizon has bought Alltel Wireless in 2009. Okay, at the turn of the century, when we went through the Industrial Revolution, there are a lot of folks that came up in that let's just say it was kind of loose. The Industrial Revolution was taking place. Laws had not been able to catch up with what was happening. There was no antitrust division of the Justice Department. So there were a lot of people who knew what they were doing and built companies, huge companies, and made fortunes during the Industrial Revolution by vertical integration. Let's talk about what that is. Okay, so turn of the century, Industrial Revolution, a lot of individuals saw the potential gains to be made as a result of these industrial changes. People who saw what was going to happen and what needed to be done to enrich themselves. The robber barons were called because they accumulated vast empires, some of them by misdeeds, others by taking advantage of the lack of regulation and control. As I said, at this time, turn of the century, there was no Justice Department antitrust division. The government was completely a hands-off type of environment. Now, also, in addition to that, there was no progressive income tax, no labor department, and again, as I said, no antitrust division. So while these guys are accumulating all that wealth, they were not paying any income taxes. It'd be nice today to have that situation. So there are familiar names of the robber barons. When depression hit in October 1929, the unemployment rate reached 20% of the labor force. People were out of jobs, had to wait in long lines just to get food for their families. It was a horrible time for people. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no fallback position to take money out of a 401k or a retirement plan. None of that existed. So there was no money to buy food. People were out of a job and had to wait. The men had to wait in lines to get food for their families. Some of the familiar names of people who, however, while this was going on, did very well. John D. Rockefeller built and bought Standard Oil. J.P. Morgan, which is a investment banking firm today, was strong in finance. Andrew Mellon Bank in New York, was strong in finance and oil. Andrew Carnegie from Scotland was big deal in steel. And John Jacob Astor was big in real estate in New York. I don't know if you saw the movie Titanic, but he died on the Titanic. And I think in the movie they showed him in the bar having a drink as the good ship went down. So these guys were called the robber barons. John D. Rockefeller was the richest man in the world. He was second only to Andrew Carnegie, who built a steel empire. Andrew Carnegie was just an immigrant from Scotland, but he saw an opportunity. All right, John D. Rockefeller. He was much maligned during the Depression. You have to remember, when things were so bad during the Depression, usually when things turn rotten, people look for somebody to blame. Well, these guys took the blame, as well as the government. The president of the United States at the time lost his job, lost the election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So we had to play the blame game, and John D. Rockefeller was the key, if you will, person we're going to pin the tail on the donkey. In 1839, he died in 1937. He became the richest man in America. He founded Standard Oil of Ohio, which later became Standard Oil of New Jersey. Now, he had partners, but what he did to achieve his vast wealth was vertically integrate the oil business. That meant that what he did was we went out and bought the oil wells, producing oil and selling oil off. Then he went out and bought the distribution trucks and companies that were distributing oil to the refineries. Then he went out and bought the refineries. And then he went out and bought the distribution from the refineries to the local gas stations and service stations. And then he went out and bought the service stations. So he had completely and fully integrated Standard Oil of New Jersey to be the largest oil company in the United States. And he made a fortune doing it. Now, you could not do that today, as I gave you the example of what AT&T is trying to do, to not only have a satellite dish company, but also a cable company. You couldn't have done this in today's world. So he owned the oil wellhead, the refinery, the distribution, and the retail outlets. Totally integrated. At one time, he was considered to own 90% of the oil industry in the United States. Can you imagine the tremendous wealth, even in those days, even at those prices, that he accumulated with 90% of the oil industry in the United States? Absolutely amazing. And again, I remind you, he was not paying any income taxes. Okay, however, the government started to get smart. We passed, prior to his, well, at the same time that's going on, they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1911. And it According to that act, he was forced to dissolve his interest in Standard Oil, and it was broken up into different Standard Oils, different companies. Standard Oil of Jersey, Standard Oil of Ohio, etc. Andrew Carnegie, another robber baron, probably the second richest. His philosophy was the best time to expand is when no one else dares take the risk. This guy was a super risk taker. He died in 1919, born in 1835. He's born in Scotland, humble beginnings. He became the second richest man in America, second only to John D. Rockefeller. So how did he do it? Through horizontal integration of raw material suppliers, he gained control over most of the steel production in the U.S. Again, just like oil. Can you imagine having control over all the steel production that goes on in the United States? He was the world's largest manufacturer of pig iron, steel rails, and coke. One of the things that was happening at this time, and also had its own robber barons like Averell Harriman, the railroad companies were building like crazy. They were building a rail line from West Coast to East Coast, putting rail lines down all over the place. And the government was giving them the land to do it. So they needed steel for those rails. They needed steel for the wheels. They needed steels for the engine and the railroad cars. So Carnegie had it all locked up. In addition to being able to build the rails, he had control of the pig iron and the coke that was used to convert iron to steel. So through strategic acquisitions, including Arrival Homestead Steel, which included coal and iron fields, 425 miles of railway, and a line of lake steamships. This guy was going crazy. He eventually retired and sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan, which would later become U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel, which is symbol you'll see on the Pittsburgh Steelers helmets in the locker room. So, were they robber barons or captains of industry? Much of the blame, as I said, during the Great Depression was heaped on these guys. And it was because people were frustrated. They didn't have jobs, they didn't have money, they had to beg for their food, they had to wait in food lines, etc. So, usually we need people to blame. We found it in the robber barons. The robber barons are captains of industry. However, much like today, we needed someone to blame. However, some economists since the end of World War II have reasoned that the U.S. was able to fight a war on two fronts with the industrial might that we had was really attributed to what these gentlemen had did during their time in power. Interesting thought. Possibility, the fact of the industries that they created was the key to why we were so successful in World War II and able to fight a war on two sides. We built massive amounts of ships, airplanes, tanks. Okay? Factories that were producing automobiles were converted to tanks, airplanes. Okay? A tremendous job during World War II. And while what a lot of people, a lot of economists did was step back after it was all over and say, oh, wait a minute. Maybe these guys that built these industries were the reason we were able to respond so quickly and were able to put out the amount of armaments that we're able to do. Interesting thought. Okay, we won't go on any further. You've got that, and I will review your book on Thursday. And I'll also go back through some of these concepts as I did in the last class, because again, we're dealing with product curves and things of that nature that are to a large extent foreign to us and in some cases difficult to understand. So with that said, have a good weekend, and I will see you next Thursday.